July 11th, 1944. A salvage yard 3 miles behind Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. The afternoon sun beat down on twisted wreckage that stretched as far as the eye could see. German beach obstacles, blown apart by combat engineers on D-Day, lay in enormous rusting piles. Czech hedgehogs, angle iron. Steel beams designed to rip open landing craft, now useless scrap metal waiting to be shipped back to England for recycling. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sergeant Curtis Culin knelt in the dirt beside a Sherman tank, running his hand along a 6-foot section of German I-beam. The steel was solid, industrial grade, exactly what he needed. Around him, a work party of 4 soldiers from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron hauled more beams from the salvage pile, cutting them to length with acetylene torches. The air smelled of hot metal and diesel fuel. Culin stood, wiping sweat from his forehead, and looked at the tank. A standard M4 Sherman, 30 tons of American armor that had crossed an ocean to liberate Europe. A machine built to break through enemy lines and exploit deep into German territory. But for 6 weeks, these tanks had been stopped cold by something no military planner had anticipated. Not German panzers, not 88mm anti-tank guns, not minefields or concrete fortifications. They had been defeated by hedgerows, ancient earthen walls covered in thorns and trees, built by Norman farmers over 1,000 years. Walls that turned every field into a fortress and every advance into a nightmare. Culin had watched friends die trying to breach those walls. He had seen Shermans belly up on hedgerows, their thin underside armor exposed to German Panzerfaust rockets. He had counted the burning hulks left behind after every failed assault. And 3 days ago, during an informal, bull session with tankers and infantry, someone had made an offhand suggestion that everyone else laughed at. But Culin had not laughed. He had recognized something in that crude idea, a principle, a solution, and now he was about to prove whether that solution would work or whether he had just wasted 3 days building useless scrap metal into an even more useless contraption. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The prototype took shape over the course of that afternoon. 4 steel prongs, each 5 feet long, beveled at the forward ends to create cutting edges, a horizontal crossbar welded between them to hold the spacing. The entire assembly positioned low on the tank's front hull, angled slightly downward, so the prongs would bite into earth rather than ride up over obstacles. The welds had to be perfect, strong enough to withstand the enormous forces generated when 30 tons of tank drove into centuries-old earthen walls reinforced by tree roots. 1 weak weld could cause the whole device to fail at the moment of impact, potentially getting the crew killed. Culin worked slowly, carefully, checking each weld joint, running his hands over the steel to feel for imperfections. He was not an engineer. He had no formal training in metallurgy or structural design. He was a 29-year-old sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he had worked as a sales promotion assistant for Schenley Industries, a liquor distributor where his father also worked. But Curtis Culin had grown up during the Great Depression. He knew how to improvise, how to make do with available materials, how to fix things that were broken and build things that were needed. That kind of practical knowledge, learned through necessity rather than formal education, was about to change the course of World War II. By late afternoon, the device was complete. 4 steel tusks projecting forward from the Sherman's hull. Crude, brutal, functional. The assembled work party stood back and examined their creation. Most of them were skeptical. They had seen too many proposed solutions to the hedgerow problem, all of which had failed. Combat engineers with explosives that took too long and announced American positions to every German within miles. Bulldozer tanks that became priority targets for enemy anti-tank gunners. Direct assaults where Shermans tried to climb over hedgerows and exposed their bellies to Panzerfaust fire. Every solution had been tried. Every solution had failed or proven impractical. Why would this crude assemblage of welded scrap metal succeed where everything else had failed? but they were willing to watch, if only to be able to say they had been there when yet another crazy idea fell apart. The test hedgerow was selected carefully. It had to be representative. Not unusually small or weak. Not the kind of obstacle that might give false results. The hedgerow they chose stood 4 feet high at its earthen base, topped with 15 feet of mature vegetation, including oak trees with trunks 4 or 5 inches in diameter. This was an average Norman hedgerow, the kind American tankers encountered dozens of times every day, the kind that had been stopping Allied advances for 6 weeks. If Culin's device could breach this obstacle, it could breach most of the hedgerows in Normandy. The Sherman's engine roared to life. Black diesel smoke erupted from the exhaust. The driver, a corporal whose name has not been preserved in the historical records, was understandably nervous. If the device failed, if the tank bellied up as so many tanks had before, he and his crew might become the next casualties of the bocage. But he trusted Sergeant Culin, who had explained the theory carefully and seemed confident it would work. The tank backed up to give itself room to build speed. 50 yards, enough distance to accelerate to 10 or 12 miles per hour. Not fast by automobile standards, but plenty of momentum for 30 tons of steel and armor. The driver shifted into gear, advanced the throttle, aimed directly at the hedgerow. The watchers instinctively took a step back. This was the moment. Either the device would work and prove that one sergeant with an idea could solve a problem that had baffled an entire army for more than 5 weeks, or it would fail and Culin would return to his unit having accomplished nothing except wasting time and materials. 5 miles per hour, 8, 10. The tank accelerated toward the hedgerow. The engine sound deepened as the driver gave it full throttle. The prongs led, 4 steel tusks aimed at centuries of packed earth and interlocked tree roots. Impact. The sound was like heavy canvas tearing, a deep ripping noise as steel cut through earth and vegetation. The prongs bit into the earthen bank at ground level and penetrated deep. For a fraction of a second, it seemed the tank might stall, might be stopped by the sheer resistance of the obstacle. The engine roar increased. The treads gripped the ground and pushed forward with all the power 30 tons and 500 horsepower could generate. Earth fountained upward, blown up and over the tank's hull by the force of the breach. Branches snapped, tree trunks splintered, roots tore from soil they had occupied for decades. Vegetation showered down on the turret and rear deck. And then, less than 5 seconds after impact, the Sherman burst through to the other side of the hedgerow. The tank had not climbed the obstacle. It had not bellied up and exposed its vulnerable underside. It had cut through at ground level, exactly as Culin had predicted. The device worked. The watching soldiers erupted, not in polite applause, but in genuine cheers and shouts. Some of them were crying, not from sadness, but from relief and hope. For 6 weeks they had felt helpless against terrain that seemed unconquerable. For 6 weeks they had watched the bocage defeat every attempt to restore mobility to American armor. For 6 weeks they had bled for yards of ground, losing friends and comrades to an enemy they could barely see and obstacles they could not overcome. And now, impossibly, a simple device made from scrap metal had solved the problem. The implications were staggering. If this worked once, it could work again. If one tank could be modified, every tank could be modified. If the device was as simple and quick to manufacture as it appeared, then perhaps the entire American armored force could be equipped before the planned offensive. Perhaps the stalemate could be broken. Perhaps the breakthrough that had eluded Allied commanders for 6 weeks was finally within reach. But a single successful test was not enough. The device needed to prove itself repeatedly under various conditions. More tests were conducted over the next 2 days. Different hedgerows, different angles of approach, different speeds. Every test succeeded. Tank crews quickly learned the optimal technique. Approach at 10 to 12 miles per hour. Aim directly at the hedgerow, not at an angle. Give full throttle at impact. The tank would shudder as the prongs bit into earth, but it would drive straight through without climbing or exposing its belly. Breaching time averaged 5 to 8 seconds from impact to emergence on the far side. Compare that to the previous methods. Combat engineers using explosives required 10 to 15 minutes to blow a gap, assuming they were not killed or wounded by German defensive fire during the placement of charges. Bulldozer tanks could push through eventually, but they were slow, conspicuous, and became immediate targets for German anti-tank weapons. Direct assault by standard Shermans was suicidal, resulting in destroyed tanks and dead crews. 5 seconds. That was all it took with Culin's device. 5 seconds to accomplish what had been taking hours or proving impossible. The difference between success and failure, between life and death, between stalemate and breakthrough. Word spread rapidly through the 2nd Armoured Division. Within 3 days of the first successful test, officers at multiple levels of command had heard reports about a sergeant who had invented a hedgerow breaching device that actually worked. Major General Edward Brooks, commanding the 2nd Armoured Division, requested a formal demonstration. Brooks was a competent, aggressive commander who understood armour tactics. He recognized a breakthrough when he saw one, and he immediately grasped that this device needed to be demonstrated to the one man whose approval and support could authorize mass production and army-wide implementation. Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley, commander of the 1st United States Army, the man responsible for the entire American sector in Normandy, the man who carried on his shoulders the weight of an invasion that had succeeded on the beaches but now threatened to bog down into the same kind of static trench warfare that had characterized World War I. Bradley had been dealing with crisis after crisis for 6 weeks. His forces were exhausted, casualties mounted by the thousands. Infantry divisions that had landed on D-Day with full strength were down to 50% or less of their frontline combat power. Replacement soldiers arrived daily, but they lacked the training and experience of the men they replaced. Morale, which had been high after the successful D-Day landings, was declining as soldiers realized the war in Normandy would not be quick or easy, and the terrain itself seemed to mock every advantage the Americans possessed. Superior numbers meant nothing when attacks could only be conducted across narrow fronts. Superior firepower meant nothing when German defenders were invisible behind earthen walls and could not be targeted effectively. Superior air power meant nothing when the dense vegetation of the bocage provided perfect concealment from aerial observation. The hedgerows were defeating an army that had crossed an ocean and stormed the most heavily defended beaches in the world. They were threatening to turn the greatest amphibious invasion in history into a catastrophic failure. Bradley needed a solution. He needed mobility restored to American armor. He needed a way to break through the bocage before the Germans could bring up reinforcements and solidify their defenses. He needed a miracle. And on July 14, 1944, he got one. The demonstration was scheduled for early afternoon at a location near the town of Isigny-sur-Mer, several miles inland from Omaha Beach. Bradley arrived with an entourage that included Major General Leonard Guerreau of 5th Corps and several ordnance specialists. The general was skeptical. He had seen proposed solutions before, all of which had failed or proven impractical. But Brooks had insisted this was different, and Bradley trusted his division commanders enough to take time away from his headquarters to witness the demonstration personally. 2 tanks had been prepared, an M5A1 Stuart light tank and an M4 Sherman medium tank, both equipped with Culin's device. The hedgerow selected for the demonstration was carefully chosen to be representative of typical bocage terrain, 5-foot earthen bank topped with thick brush and mature trees. The kind of obstacle that had stopped American advances for 6 weeks. Bradley and his officers took up positions where they could observe clearly without being in danger if something went wrong. The light tank performed first. Engine noise, the smell of diesel exhaust, the tank backing up to gain speed, then acceleration, the charge toward the hedgerow, impact, the sound of tearing earth and breaking roots, the fountain of dirt exploding upward, and then the tank bursting through in less than 5 seconds, trailing broken branches and torn vegetation but otherwise completely undamaged. Before anyone in the group could fully process what they had just witnessed, the Sherman demonstrated the same capability. Its greater weight and power drove through the obstacle with even more dramatic effect, cutting through centuries-old earthen wall like it was soft clay rather than packed soil reinforced by tree roots. Bradley stood silent for a moment. His face showed no expression, but his mind raced through implications. 6 weeks of stalemate, thousands of casualties, an offensive scheduled to launch in 11 days that might fail if tanks could not maneuver through the bocage. And here, demonstrated twice in the space of 2 minutes, was the solution. Simple, reliable, achievable with available materials. He turned to Lieutenant Colonel John Medaris, his ordnance chief, and issued orders that would set in motion a manufacturing effort unprecedented in its speed and scale. Every ordnance company, every maintenance battalion, every repair depot in the American sector would begin immediate production of these devices. Round-the-clock work, 24 hours a day. Every welder, every cutting torch, every available man would be mobilized. The goal was to equip as many tanks as possible before Operation Cobra launched on July 25th. That meant 11 days to manufacture hundreds of devices, transport them to units scattered across Normandy, and weld them onto tanks. It meant improvising a mass production system for a device that had been invented less than a week earlier. It meant transforming one sergeant's improvised solution into an army-wide capability in less than 2 weeks. But if it could be done, if American armor could be given this mobility advantage before the offensive began, then perhaps the breakthrough was possible. Perhaps the hedgerows could be beaten, perhaps the stalemate could be broken, and the war of attrition could be transformed into a war of maneuver, where American advantages in numbers, firepower, and logistics could be fully exploited. The question was not whether to do it. The question was whether it could be done in time. Lieutenant Colonel Medaris returned to his headquarters and within hours had issued orders that mobilized the entire American Ordnance Organization in Normandy. Every ordnance company received specifications transmitted by telephone and radio. 4 steel prongs, approximately 5 feet long, made from German beach obstacle steel, beveled cutting edges on the forward ends, crossbar to hold prongs in position, entire assembly welded to the lower front hull of the tank, simple enough that any competent welder could fabricate it, complex enough that it required skill and care to ensure the welds would hold under combat stress. The raw material was abundant. Salvage yards behind the invasion beaches contained thousands of tons of steel from destroyed German obstacles. The Czech hedgehogs that were supposed to have ripped open Allied landing craft on D-Day had failed to stop the invasion. Now they would be repurposed into the instruments of German defeat. Trucks began hauling steel beams to ordnance units across Normandy. The beams arrived still covered with rust and barnacles from their time underwater. Some still showed damage from explosives or shell fire. Ordnance troops sorted through them, selecting beams that were straight and undamaged, rejecting any that showed cracks or severe corrosion. The selected beams were cut to length using acetylene torches, beveled on the ends to create cutting edges, and set aside for welding. The welding work was brutal. Summer heat in Normandy in July 1944 reached into the 80s and 90s Fahrenheit. Welders worked in heavy leather protective gear, wearing face shields and gloves, manipulating steel beams that weighed over 100 pounds each. The work was done outdoors or in canvas-sheltered areas because there was no time to set up proper workshops. Each device required multiple hours of welding. The 4 prongs had to be welded to the crossbar. The crossbar had to be welded to the tank's hull. Every weld had to be strong enough to withstand the enormous forces generated when the tank drove into a hedgerow at full speed. A weak weld could fail at the moment of impact, potentially causing the tank to belly up on the obstacle exactly as unmodified tanks did, exactly as crews feared would happen. The ordnance units worked in shifts, 24 hours a day. Welders worked 6-hour shifts, then rested while other crews took over. Acetylene tanks and welding rods had to be trucked in constantly to keep the work going. When one ordnance company ran low on materials, trucks would be dispatched to transfer supplies from units that had excess. The entire system operated with the kind of flexible improvisation that characterized American military logistics at its best. There were no detailed plans, no carefully calculated production schedules, just the urgent need to produce as many devices as possible before Operation Cobra launched. Tank crews from combat units would drive their vehicles to the nearest ordnance facility and wait while the device was fabricated and installed. Some crews waited 6 or 8 hours, others waited overnight. but they waited because they understood what this device meant. They had lost friends to Panzerfaust fire when tanks bellied up on hedgerows. They had watched crews burn to death in Shermans that could not escape after being hit. They had experienced the suffocating terror of being trapped in a metal box that had become a target. Culin's device might save their lives. It might give them the ability to choose their own routes through the bocage, rather than being forced to follow roads where German anti-tank guns waited in ambush. It might restore the tactical flexibility that made armour effective. They were willing to wait as long as necessary to get their tanks modified. The modified tanks began appearing in combat units in mid-July. At first, just a few. A handful per battalion. Crews with modified tanks volunteered for the most dangerous missions, testing the devices under actual combat conditions. The reports that came back were uniformly positive. The devices worked exactly as demonstrated. Tanks could breach hedgerows in seconds without exposing their vulnerable undersides. Tank commanders could choose their own routes through the bocage, rather than being forced to follow predictable paths. The tactical flexibility was transformative. By July 20th, 5 days before Operation Cobra was scheduled to begin, approximately 300 tanks in First Army had been fitted with Culin's device. This represented roughly 15% of American armour in the theatre. It was not enough. Bradley wanted more. Medaris pushed production harder. More ordnance units were diverted from other tasks. More welders were pulled from maintenance work and set to manufacturing, hedgerow cutters. The pace became frantic, desperate, driven by the knowledge that Operation Cobra was approaching, and every tank without a device was a tank that might be stopped by the bocage. By July 24th, the day before the offensive launched, approximately 500 devices had been manufactured and installed. This represented nearly 60% of the Sherman medium tanks, Stuart light tanks, and M10 tank destroyers that would participate in the offensive. It was not 100%. There had not been enough time. But it was enough. Enough to give American armour the mobility it needed. Enough to restore tactical flexibility. Enough to break the stalemate that had threatened to turn the Normandy invasion into a disaster. The tanks themselves looked fearsome with their new equipment. 4 steel prongs projecting from each hull gave the Shermans an aggressive, almost predatory appearance. Soldiers began calling them rhino tanks, drawing the obvious comparison to the horned animals of Africa. Others called them rhinoceros tanks, or simply rhinos. The names stuck. Within days, everyone in the American Army knew what a rhino tank was, and everyone understood that these modified vehicles represented something more than just a mechanical improvement. They represented hope. The possibility that the nightmare of the bocage might finally be ending, that mobility could be restored, that the offensive might succeed, that the sacrifices of the past 6 weeks had not been in vain. Curtis Culin, meanwhile, had returned to his unit and his regular duties. He was not present for the mass production effort. He did not supervise the installation of devices on hundreds of tanks. He had done his part by inventing the solution and proving it worked. Now it was up to others to implement it on the scale necessary to change the course of the campaign. He was a sergeant, a tanker, not a hero, not a celebrity, just a soldier who had seen a problem and figured out how to fix it. But others had taken notice. Word reached higher levels of command about the sergeant from New Jersey who had invented the device that might break the Normandy stalemate. Recommendations for recognition began working their way through military channels, and the stage was being set for Curtis Culin to become, as historian Max Hastings would later write, a very American kind of national hero. But before we continue with Curtis Culin's story, we need to understand what made his invention necessary. We need to understand the nightmare that was the Norman bocage, because without understanding the problem, we cannot fully appreciate the brilliance of the solution. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The greatest amphibious invasion in history. More than 150,000 American, British, and Canadian troops stormed 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. Despite horrific casualties, particularly on Omaha Beach, where American forces nearly were thrown back into the sea. By nightfall, the Allies had established footholds along 50 miles of French coastline. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable fortress Europe, had been breached. The invasion had succeeded beyond even the most optimistic projections, but success on the beaches was only the first step. The grand strategy called for rapid breakout from the beachhead. British and Canadian forces would seize Caen, a critical road and rail junction, and push south into open tank country. American forces would cut across the Cotentin Peninsula, capture the port of Cherbourg, then wheel south toward Brittany. Within 2 weeks, Allied planners expected forces to extend 15 miles inland along a continuous front. Mobile warfare, rapid exploitation, armoured thrusts deep into German rear areas. This was the vision that had guided 2 years of planning. Instead, the Allies encountered something that intelligence officers had failed to adequately assess during the planning phase, something that aerial photographs had revealed but whose tactical significance had been completely misunderstood: the bocage, the hedgerows of Normandy. Ancient earthen boundaries between fields that would prove more formidable than German concrete fortifications, more effective than minefields, more deadly than the Atlantic Wall itself. June 7, 1944. 24 hours after the successful landing on Omaha Beach, soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, pushed inland from the coast. They were exhausted from the beach assault, having suffered nearly 2,000 casualties in the landing. But they were alive. They had broken through the Atlantic Wall. They expected to encounter retreating German forces, perhaps some hastily prepared defensive positions in villages and towns inland. What they found instead was a landscape that seemed designed by nature itself to favour defenders and destroy attackers. The bocage was not hedges in any sense that American soldiers understood from back home. These were not decorative shrub borders around suburban yards. These were not agricultural fencing that could be cut or pushed aside. These were ancient fortifications built up over centuries by Norman farmers who had shaped this landscape since the Middle Ages. The process had begun 1,000 years earlier, when farmers cleared their fields of stones and rocks, piling them along property boundaries to mark ownership and create barriers for livestock. Generation after generation had added to these walls. More stones, more earth. Seeds from plants growing on top would fall and take root. Trees would sprout. Over centuries, the walls grew into earthen banks 3 to 12 feet high and 1 to 10 feet thick at the base. The soil composing these banks was packed hard as concrete, compacted by centuries of settling and reinforced by root systems of vegetation growing on top. On these earthen ramparts grew oak trees, hawthorn bushes, brambles, wild roses, thorns that intertwined into barriers rising 15 feet above the earthen base. The roots penetrated deep into the banks, some extending 10 or 15 feet down through the packed earth, creating a reinforced structure stronger than most man-made fortifications. These root systems were so dense, so thoroughly intertwined after centuries of growth, that the hedgerows could not be dug through without power tools and could not be blown apart without massive explosive charges that would reveal American positions to every German within miles. These hedgerows surrounded irregular fields that varied wildly in size but averaged 200 to 400 yards across. Some fields were nearly square, others long and narrow, some triangular. The pattern was completely irregular, the product of 1,000 years of inheritance law, land division, and agricultural practice. Aerial photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft in the weeks before D-Day had revealed the true scope of the problem, though intelligence officers failed to appreciate its tactical significance. One photograph of the American sector covering just 8 square miles near Saint-Lô showed nearly 4,000 separate hedge-enclosed fields. Each field was a potential fortress. Each hedgerow formed a defensive wall, and there were thousands of them stretching across the entire American sector from the coast to the base of the Cotentin Peninsula and south toward Saint-Lô. For German defenders, every hedgerow was a ready-made defensive position superior to anything military engineers could construct. Machine gun teams could dig firing positions into the earthen banks, creating small apertures just large enough for the gun barrel that overlooked open fields. These positions were invisible from more than a few yards away, protected from artillery by the earthen bank itself, immune to everything except a direct hit by large-caliber shells. The vegetation on top provided perfect concealment from Aerial observation. Spotter planes flying overhead saw only an unbroken canopy of green. A single German squad, 8 or 9 men properly positioned behind a hedgerow with a machine gun and rifles, could cover an entire field and hold off an American company of 200 men for hours. The Germans did not need continuous defensive lines. They simply positioned small groups throughout the bocage, creating a defense in depth where each position supported others. When American forces attacked across a field, they faced fire not just from the hedgerow directly in front, but from hedgerows on their flanks, creating crossfire that turned every field into a killing zone. American infantrymen attempting to cross open fields were completely exposed. No cover in the middle of a Norman field, no trees, no rocks, no depressions in the ground, just open grass or crops with German machine guns and rifles covering every square yard from positions that could not be seen until they opened fire. The Germans had already registered their weapons on likely crossing points, marking ranges, calculating angles, preparing to deliver fire the instant American troops emerged from the previous hedgerow. Making the approach to the next hedgerow was a journey through pre-targeted killing zones where German gunners did not need to aim. They simply fired at predetermined points and hit whatever was there. And American tanks, the Sherman medium tanks that were supposed to be the key to mobile warfare and rapid exploitation, were neutralized completely by the bocage. The Sherman was a good tank by any reasonable standard. Its 75mm gun could destroy any German tank at normal combat ranges. It was reliable, easy to maintain, produced in quantities German industry could not match. American factories were building Shermans at a rate of more than 1,000 per month. But all these advantages meant nothing in the bocage because Sherman tanks could not penetrate hedgerows. The earthen banks were too thick, too solid, too heavily reinforced by root systems. A Sherman's 75mm gun could blow a hole in the vegetation on top, but that did not create a breach large enough for the tank to pass through. The earthen base remained intact. Tank commanders, frustrated and desperate, began attempting to breach obstacles by brute force. They would back up to get a running start, then accelerate directly at the hedgerow, attempting to use the tank's weight and power to smash through or climb over. This tactic was suicidal. When a Sherman attempted to ride up and over a hedgerow, the front of the tank would rise as it climbed the earthen bank. The tank would tilt backward at an angle of 30 or 40 degrees. This exposed the belly of the tank, the underside between the tracks, which was protected by only 1 inch of steel armor. This armor was designed merely to resist mine fragments, not to stop anti-tank weapons. A German soldier with a Panzerfaust, the shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket issued to German infantry by the thousands, could position himself in the next field and simply wait. He would hear the tank engine roaring as the Sherman climbed the hedgerow. He would see the front of the tank rise above the vegetation, and when the belly armor was exposed, he would fire. 1 rocket was usually sufficient. The Panzerfaust could penetrate nearly 6 inches of armor. Against the Sherman's 1-inch belly plate, it was devastatingly effective. Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Yale, commanding a tank battalion in the 2nd Armored Division, lost 4 Sherman tanks in a single morning attempting to breach hedgerows near the town of Isigny. 4 tanks destroyed, 4 crews killed or wounded, 16 men dead or injured, and not a single successful breach. His after-action report, filed on June 15th, captured the frustration and rage felt by every American armor officer in Normandy. The enemy need not even see our tanks to destroy them. They position themselves in the next field behind the next hedgerow and simply wait. They listen for the sound of our engines. They hear us climbing the obstacle. And when we reach the top, when our belly is exposed, they fire. We are losing crews and machines to an enemy we never see, never engage, never have a chance to fight. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. American forces tried every solution their training and doctrine suggested. Combat engineers trained in demolitions were brought forward to blow gaps in hedgerows using explosives. This technique worked technically. A properly placed charge of TNT could blast a hole through even the thickest hedgerow, creating an opening large enough for a Sherman to pass through. But the tactic had fatal flaws. First, it was slow. Engineers had to move forward under fire, approach the hedgerow, place charges, connect, detonators, retreat to a safe distance, and blow the charge. This process took 10 to 15 minutes, under ideal conditions, longer under fire. Second, the explosions announced American intentions to every German within hearing, which in the relatively quiet Norman countryside meant every German within 2 or 3 miles. Enemy machine gunners and mortar teams would train their weapons on the gap before the smoke cleared. Third, American infantry and tanks advancing through these blown breaches were funneled into a single narrow opening that became a pre-targeted killing zone. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Specialized armored vehicles, particularly bulldozer tanks, proved little better. These were standard Sherman tanks fitted with heavy steel bulldozer blades on the front, designed originally for clearing beach obstacles during amphibious landings. In theory, these vehicles could push through or scrape aside hedgerows, creating passages for following tanks. In practice, they became priority targets for German anti-tank gunners. The bulldozer tanks were slower than standard Shermans, less maneuverable, highly conspicuous. German observers would identify them immediately and direct anti-tank fire at them, knowing that destroying the bulldozers would deny Americans their primary means of breaching obstacles. By late June 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day, the American advance had slowed to a nightmarish crawl, measured not in miles per day, but in yards per hour. The human cost was staggering and unsustainable. Official United States Army histories document that 8th Corps, advancing through the bocage toward La Haye-du-Puits, suffered over 10,000 casualties while advancing approximately 7 miles. The capture of Montcastre, a hill overlooking the Cotentin Peninsula, cost American forces approximately 2,000 casualties in brutal close-quarters fighting. The 1st Infantry Division, which had landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, lost 75% of its frontline infantry in the first month of combat. Companies that had landed with 150 men were down to 30 or 40 effectives. This was not mobile warfare. This was not the rapid exploitation Allied planners had envisioned. This was attritional combat, where every field had to be fought for, every hedgerow assaulted, every few hundred yards of ground purchased with American blood. And America, for all its industrial might and manpower reserves, could not sustain these casualty rates indefinitely. The replacement system was already strained. New soldiers arriving in Normandy were being rushed into combat with minimal training, thrown into veteran units to fill gaps left by dead and wounded. Morale, which had been high after successful D-Day landings, was declining rapidly. Soldiers who had survived the beach assault and thought they had faced the worst the war could offer were being broken by the grinding brutality of hedgerow combat. General Omar Nelson Bradley, commander of the 1st United States Army, faced a crisis that threatened not just his personal reputation, but the entire strategic plan for the invasion of Europe. His forces were exhausted, demoralized, bleeding irreplaceable infantrymen at rates that could not be sustained. British and Canadian forces to the east, fighting around the city of Caen, were making equally limited progress against heavy German armour. Field Marshal Montgomery's plan to seize Caen on D-Day had failed completely. The city would not fall until mid-July, more than a month behind schedule. The grand strategy that had guided 2 years of planning, the vision of rapid breakout and mobile warfare across France, was collapsing into the same kind of static trench warfare that had characterized the Western Front in World War I. Bradley's chief of staff described the situation in blunt terms that captured the growing sense of crisis. In the bocage of Normandy, every small field is a fortress, every hedgerow a German strongpoint. We are fighting World War I again, but this time the trenches are green and growing. Our advantages in mobility, armour, and firepower are negated by terrain. The Germans are trading space for casualties, and they are winning that exchange. Into this desperate situation, where the entire Normandy campaign teetered on the edge of failure, came Curtis Culin with his simple solution. 4 steel prongs welded to the front of a tank, scrap metal repurposed from German beach obstacles. A device so simple that, as General Bradley would later write, it was absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. But simplicity does not diminish importance. Often the best solutions are simple. Often the most effective weapons are not the most sophisticated, but merely the ones that solve the immediate problem. The story of how Culin came to invent his device reveals something fundamental about American military culture at its best: the willingness to listen to ideas from any source, regardless of rank or formal credentials, the ability to implement promising solutions rapidly without getting bogged down in bureaucratic procedures, the practical problem-solving tradition that valued results over theory. In early July 1944, during a brief respite from combat operations, soldiers from Culin's unit gathered in an informal group to discuss the hedgerow problem. This was not an official meeting or planning session, just soldiers talking, sharing frustrations, venting anger about their situation. Tank crews, infantry, officers all contributed to the conversation. They talked about friends who had been killed or wounded. They talked about tanks that had been destroyed attempting to breach hedgerows. They shared ideas, most of them impractical or impossible, about how to solve the problem. At some point in this discussion, a soldier from Tennessee made a suggestion that sounded to most of the group like a joke, or perhaps the ramblings of a man driven half-mad by combat stress. Military historian Max Hastings identifies this soldier only as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts. Hastings provides no first name, no rank, no unit designation. Despite extensive research by military historians in the decades since, no primary source has ever been found that verifies this man's identity or even confirms his existence. Nevertheless, according to Hastings, this soldier said something like, "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" Most of the soldiers listening laughed or dismissed the idea immediately. It sounded ridiculous. Saw teeth on a tank, like some kind of cartoon monster. But Curtis Culin, sitting quietly in the group, did not laugh. He heard something in the suggestion that others missed. He recognized that beneath the crude phrasing was a mechanically sound principle. If tanks could not climb over hedgerows without exposing their vulnerable undersides, and if they could not punch through the solid earthen banks by brute force, then perhaps they could cut through them. Use the tank's own weight and power to drive steel blades through the base of the hedgerow, severing roots and penetrating earth like a plough cutting through tough soil. Culin was uniquely positioned to recognize this possibility. He was not a formally trained engineer who might have dismissed the idea as theoretically unsound. He was a practical mechanic who understood how machines worked and how materials behaved. He was 29 years old in the summer of 1944, a sergeant serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. His background was utterly ordinary. Born in Cranford, New Jersey, on February 10, 1915, raised in a middle-class family. His father worked as a salesman. Curtis attended local public schools, graduating from Cleveland High School in Cranford in 1935. Before the war, he had worked as a sales promotion assistant for Schenley Industries, a liquor distributor where his father also worked. When war came, he enlisted in the New Jersey National Guard and was mobilized with his unit. He was trained as a tanker and driver. He knew how to maintain and operate Sherman tanks. He knew how to fight in armored combat. But he had no special technical expertise that would suggest he was about to solve a problem that had baffled the best minds in the American military establishment. What Curtis Culin had was something that could not be taught in any school or acquired through formal training. He had practical American ingenuity, the kind of problem-solving ability that came from growing up during the Great Depression, when money was scarce and you learned to fix things yourself. To make do with whatever materials were available. To improvise solutions rather than waiting for someone else to solve your problems. This was a particularly American trait, born of a culture that valued individual initiative and practical results over formal credentials and theoretical knowledge. It was the same spirit that had driven American inventors and innovators for generations, from Benjamin Franklin experimenting with electricity to the Wright brothers building an airplane in a bicycle shop. Culin began thinking about the problem systematically. He envisioned a set of steel prongs, or tusks, projecting forward from the tank's hull. These prongs would need to be angled slightly downward, so that when the tank drove into a hedgerow, they would bite into the earthen bank at ground level, rather than riding up the face of the obstacle. As the tank continued forward with full engine power, the prongs would cut through roots and earth, while the tank's weight kept it level and prevented the dangerous upward tilt that exposed belly armor. The concept was simple, elegant, achievable with available technology. But it required the right materials. The prongs needed to be strong enough to penetrate centuries of packed earth and dense root systems, heavy enough to hold their position under stress, but not so heavy they overloaded tank suspension or reduced mobility. They needed to be made from high-quality steel that would not bend or break under enormous forces involved in cutting through a hedgerow. Where could such materials be found in Normandy in July 1944? The answer was literally lying on the beaches where the invasion had taken place 6 weeks earlier. Before D-Day, German engineers had installed thousands upon thousands of obstacles along the Normandy coast, creating a barrier system designed to destroy Allied landing craft before they could reach shore. Among the most common obstacles were devices called Czech hedgehogs, named for their resemblance to anti-tank obstacles the Czech army had developed before the war. Each hedgehog was constructed from 3 steel I-beams, industrial-grade structural steel, about 6 feet long, welded together at angles to form a 6-pointed obstacle that looked somewhat like a giant jack from a children's game. These hedgehogs were supposed to rip open hulls of landing craft or provide anchor points for mines. In the event, the invasion had bypassed or destroyed most of them. Thousands of Czech hedgehogs now lay scattered along invasion beaches, having failed to stop the Allied assault. They had been pushed aside by landing forces, blown up by combat engineers, or simply bypassed. The steel beams, still intact and of excellent quality, were being collected in salvage yards behind the beaches, waiting to be shipped back to England for recycling. Here was exactly what Culin needed: high-quality structural steel already cut to convenient lengths, available in unlimited quantities. And so Curtis Culin built his prototype. He gathered a work party. He requisitioned welding equipment. He salvaged steel beams from the German obstacles that had failed to stop D-Day. And over the course of 3 days, in early July 1944, he transformed scrap metal into the device that would break the Normandy stalemate. The demonstration on July 14th convinced Bradley to authorize immediate mass production. The frantic manufacturing effort that followed, with ordnance units working around the clock to produce 500 devices in 11 days, equipped American armor with the mobility it needed for Operation Cobra. And on July 25, 1944, when the offensive began, Rhino tanks led the breakthrough. They crashed through hedgerows that had stopped American advances for 6 weeks. They restored tactical mobility to American armor. They transformed the bocage from an impenetrable maze into merely difficult terrain that could be overcome. The German defensive plan, which relied on using hedgerows to channel American attacks into pre-targeted killing zones, collapsed when American tanks could suddenly appear from unexpected directions, breaching obstacles at will. Within a week, the breakthrough was complete. American forces poured through gaps in German lines. The town of Avranches fell, opening routes south into Brittany and east towards central France. The 3rd United States Army, under General George Patton, was activated and began its famous dash across France. Paris was liberated 1 month later. The Falaise Pocket encirclement trapped and destroyed German forces. The war that had been static for 6 weeks suddenly became mobile again, and American advantages in numbers, firepower, and logistics could finally be exploited. For Curtis Culin, recognition came in multiple forms. General Bradley personally recommended him for the Legion of Merit, a decoration typically reserved for officers who had distinguished themselves through exceptionally meritorious conduct. The citation praised Culin's contribution to the success of Operation Cobra and noted that his invention had saved countless American lives by restoring tactical mobility to American armored forces at a critical moment. Newspapers in the United States picked up the story and transformed Culin into a minor celebrity. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle, his hometown newspaper, published a feature article on September 7, 1944, describing how a local sergeant had invented a device that revolutionized warfare in Normandy. But Curtis Culin himself, demonstrating the modesty that characterized him throughout his life, refused to take full credit for the invention. In interviews with his commanders and later with journalists, he repeatedly attempted to give credit to the Tennessee soldier, whose offhand suggestion had sparked the initial idea. Culin insisted that this man, whoever he was, deserved recognition for the concept. Even though Culin had been the one to develop the actual working device, build the prototype, test it, and demonstrate it to Bradley. This attempt at sharing credit, though honorable, was largely forgotten in the publicity surrounding the invention. 4 months after his moment of triumph, Curtis Culin's war ended in Germany's Hürtgen Forest, November 2nd, 1944. The 102nd Cavalry Group, along with numerous other American units, fought in the Hürtgen Forest, a heavily wooded area along the German-Belgian border. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest was one of the longest and most brutal battles fought by American forces in Europe, a grinding attritional struggle in terrain that resembled the bocage in its difficulty, but with the added horrors of winter weather and fanatical German resistance on their own soil. During combat operations, Sergeant Curtis Culin was moving through the forest when he stepped on a German anti-personnel mine. The explosion shattered his left leg. He fell, and, in falling, detonated a second mine that severely wounded his right thigh. He was evacuated under fire by his comrades, transported to a field hospital, then evacuated through the medical chain to rear area facilities in Belgium and eventually England. Surgeons saved his life, but could not save his leg. The shattered limb was amputated. His combat service was over. Curtis Culin returned to the United States in 1945 for continued recovery and rehabilitation. He married Bernice Enright in 1945 in Cranford, though the marriage would later end in divorce in the early 1950s. He settled in New York City and, like millions of other veterans, returned to civilian life and attempted to build a normal existence after years of war. He took a job as a salesman for Schenley Industries, the same liquor distributor that had employed his father and for which Curtis himself had worked before the war. He raised a family. He lived quietly. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences or his contribution to the Allied victory in France. On January 10, 1961, just 10 days before leaving office, outgoing President Dwight David Eisenhower delivered remarks upon receiving an award at the Statler Hilton Hotel in Washington. In that speech, delivered before an audience of engineers and business leaders, Eisenhower chose to tell Curtis Culin's story as an example of American innovation. Eisenhower, who had been Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe and had overseen the Normandy invasion from the highest strategic level, said, "There was a little sergeant. His name was Culin, and he had an idea. And his idea was that we could fasten knives, great big steel knives, in front of these tanks, and as they came along they would cut off these banks right at ground level. They would go through on the level keel, would carry with themselves a little bit of camouflage for a while, and this idea was brought to the captain, to the major, to the colonel, and it got high enough that somebody did something about it, and that was General Bradley, and he did it very quickly." Eisenhower continued, emphasizing the broader lesson. The biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked. It saved thousands of lives. Curtis Grubb Culin III died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, New York. He was 48 years old. He was buried with military honors in Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, near his hometown of Cranford. He was laid to rest as a veteran of the 102nd Cavalry Group, recipient of the Legion of Merit, Purple Heart, and other decorations. The man whose improvised invention had broken the Normandy stalemate and contributed decisively to the Allied victory in France. A memorial plaque was later placed on a boulder outside the Cranford Municipal Building in New Jersey, commemorating his service and his contribution to the Allied victory. The Culin hedgerow cutter remained in use by American armored forces throughout the remainder of the war in Europe, though its importance diminished as Allied forces left the bocage of Normandy and entered more open terrain of central and eastern France. Many rhino-equipped tanks fought in the liberation of Paris, the race across France, even the winter campaigns in Germany. But the hedgerows that had made the device necessary were unique to Normandy. The British forces in Normandy, observing American rhino tanks and recognizing their value, quickly developed their own version. British ordnance units called their version prongs and began manufacturing them in mid-July from German beach obstacles, using exactly the same source material Americans had discovered. By August 1944, British factories had manufactured 600 Mark I prongs, which were shipped to Normandy and fitted to Sherman tanks in British and Canadian units. Production continued through autumn, with additional variants manufactured for use on various tank types. The story of Curtis Culin and the hedgerow cutter has become an enduring part of American military tradition and is regularly taught at service academies, staff, colleges, and professional military education courses as a case study in battlefield innovation and organizational flexibility. The story illustrates several lessons that remain relevant to military operations decades later. First, it demonstrates the critical importance of creating organizational cultures that encourage innovation at all levels of command structure. Curtis Culin was a sergeant, an enlisted man, not an officer or trained engineer. Yet his immediate superiors were willing to listen to his idea, provide resources for testing, and forward successful demonstrations to higher command levels. Second, the story illustrates the value of practical ingenuity and hands-on problem-solving over formal training and theoretical knowledge in dealing with unexpected challenges. The bocage was a tactical problem that had not been anticipated by Allied intelligence or planning staffs. No doctrine existed for fighting in this type of terrain. No equipment had been developed specifically for bocage operations. The solution came not from high-level planning or research and development laboratories, but from a soldier on the ground who looked at the problem, thought about available materials, and figured out a practical solution. Third, the story demonstrates the critical importance of rapid implementation once a promising solution has been identified. Bradley's decision to authorize immediate mass production, mobilizing every ordnance unit in the American sector for round-the-clock manufacturing, transformed one sergeant's improvisation into an army-wide capability in less than 2 weeks. This speed of implementation was possible only because American military logistics and industrial capacity were flexible enough to support rapid improvisation. The greatest weapons are not always the most powerful or most advanced. Sometimes they are simply the ones that solve the problem at hand, created by ordinary people with extraordinary insight, tested under the most demanding conditions possible, and implemented with the speed and determination that only nations fighting for survival can muster. The story of the rhino tanks and the sergeant who invented them stands as enduring testament to the power of innovation, the importance of organizational flexibility, and the decisive impact that individual initiative can have when leaders are wise enough to recognize good ideas and bold enough to act on them immediately. Curtis Culin's simple welding job broke the Normandy stalemate, changed the course of World War II, and helped free a continent from tyranny. 4 steel prongs welded to the front of a tank, scrap metal from German beach obstacles. A device so simple it seemed absurd. Yet it worked. And in war, that is all that matters. The weapon that solves the problem is the best weapon, regardless of how simple or sophisticated it might be. A farmboy's insane weld job, as the title suggests, though Culin was no farmboy but a liquor salesman's son from suburban New Jersey. But the spirit is the same. An ordinary American with practical skills and the courage to try something new when everyone else had given up. That is the legacy Curtis Culin left behind. Not just the 500 hedgerow cutters that equipped American tanks in July 1944. Not just the thousands of lives saved and the breakthrough that led to victory, but the example he set for every generation that followed, the proof that one person with a good idea and the determination to implement it can change history. That genius is not always found in universities or laboratories, but sometimes in workshops and garages, where practical men and women solve problems with whatever materials are at hand. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.